No nation should ever be expected to act against its own self-preservation. And yet, this is precisely what the United States has been compelled to do. It's been compelled to forsake its duty to its own people, to forsake its identity and its cultural history, to cater to the needs of others in the name of benevolence. And it is this tendency, my friends, that has imperiled our land. And the culprit that is encouraging the United States and also nations across the Western world, including in Europe, including most importantly the United Kingdom, where the citizens of Great Britain are locked up for speaking against the multicultural threat that is behind this, it is this very culprit that I believe stands in the way of the survival and the flourishing of our country. And it is this very culprit that so many people talk about incorrectly. It is this very culprit that so many people react to either with rage or indifference, with advantage in mind or with some kind of despair in mind. But it is this culprit, the culprit of the multicultural threat, that demands a full-ranging civilizational response. That demands a response rooted in the observation of first principles, rooted in who we are as citizens and what it means to be a citizen, and most importantly, what it means to be a moral agent in a sustaining civil society. So, my friends, in this video, I will explain and diagnose the dangers of this multicultural threat, and I will argue that immigration restrictionism is the only way to beat back its excesses from destroying our society. And I will also go through the arguments against immigration restrictionism, and from there construct a more broader and healthier picture of citizenship and construct what a sound immigration policy will look like. But before we venture into those waters, my friends, I hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, my friends, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to ensure our message is successful. This is a civic conservative project. If you believe the fundamental philosophical character of the American founding generation is worth not only preserving, but pushing into the discourse with philosophical rigor and moral clarity to beat back the enemies and foes of American civilization and to renew the spirits and minds of those who love their country or those who are yearning for a deeper understanding of their country, this is the channel for you, my friends. That is civic conservatism, and that's what we push here. I encourage you to like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure our channel is successful. Thank you guys so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, I believe, my friends, there's no better point to start at in evaluating the dangers of the multicultural threat than evaluating the effect it has on the minds of the people. Minds of some people who are wrongly led to believe that they are acting out of a sort of moral strength in the name of compassion when fighting against basic acts of self-preservation that a nation undertakes. Before we get to that point, we have to first establish what the multicultural threat is. The multicultural threat is this notion that there is somehow an equal standard by which all cultures ought to be appraised by, and that equal standard ought to allow people, foreigners who come from other cultures, to come into a society and remain within their culture against the dominant culture, or even better yet, fight against the dominant culture as an oppressive force. So this multicultural threat prides coexistence over unification. It prides coexistence over assimilation. And in that way, it actually goes against the spirit of coexistence, which is cooperation, and instead makes civil society a war against all based on superficial differences that devour the premises that bring about social cohesion. And it is this multicultural threat that I argue is animating the minds of the many people who have taken to the streets in America to protest against deportations. The deportations, not just of folks who came here illegally, but of folks who were obviously criminals, who committed egregious acts of evil, who are being seen and approached under the standard of benevolence, under the standard of false compassion, to fight against what people whose minds are guided by this threat believe is an injustice. And this, my friends, is part of the problem. Western nations, including America, will not be sustained unless their own people recognize the virtue and the importance of preserving their country. But in order to do that, they must recognize the virtue and importance of what it means to be a citizen of their country, and they also must recognize the virtue and importance of their country. But if our eyes are constantly fixed to other lands and other cultures, and we are more concerned with being universally tolerant rather than being scrutinizingly critical of anyone who seeks to come into our country, then we are going to ultimately concede precious ground to people who may not have any care for our country except to use it as a haven to get their own ends, as a means to their own ends. I believe this is exactly what's happening in the UK, where again, many people are feeling a sense of cultural erosion as immigrants from the Middle East come and establish parts of their culture into wide swaths of the country and refuse to assimilate and instead conduct themselves by their own rules. In America, if we don't get the situation of cultural preservation and the whole situation of having a robust immigration system that unites moral understanding also with a restrictionism, we will not be able to weather the storm that's going to come our way. So as I mentioned, immigration restrictionism is our method here, because immigration restrictionism actually enforces the survival of a culture by pushing out those who either break the law, which is the basic level, or pushing out those who don't just break the law, but who show a disrespect to the country by harboring a foreign ideology that erodes the ethos of the country, or most importantly, by acting in ways that are blatantly ungrateful. And also, it also gives an expectation to the foreigner that they must abide and respect certain rules and behaviors. That is essentially what immigration restrictionism is. And throughout this video, I'm going to treat the terms immigrant, migrant, and so on and so forth as interchangeable, even though they have subtle differences, because ultimately the effect is the same. You have people coming into the country, whether it's through an official process in terms of immigration, or whether it's through an informal process in terms of migration, and their presence has an impact on the country, and depending on what course they take, it is either negative or it is positive. So there are two sources that arguments against immigration restrictionism, which includes deportation and includes strong immigration enforcement, come from. And these sources are benevolence and utility. The best way to understand the strength of an idea is to pose it against other ideas that seek to destroy its standing in the public mind by showing how those ideas are weak and how your idea actually builds upon their weaknesses and fills the holes that they cannot fill by virtue of their defects, which is what we're going to do right now. So let's begin with benevolence. There's this idea that America and Western nations more generally should be accepting of other peoples because other peoples may come from lands that are war-torn or come from lands that are destitute in monies and come from societies that are chaotic. And therefore, their needs place a demand upon us to accept them and accommodate them. There's another strand of this argument as well, which says that it is a compassionate act to keep people in the country, even those who have violated the act of fidelity, by staying here for decades and not becoming legal citizens, or most importantly, becoming legal citizens, but supporting causes and doing things that would flagrantly support their being removed. There's this idea that compassion ought to be the standard that allows us to tolerate this behavior and keep them there despite the offenses committed, despite the moral offenses committed. Well, we should address these arguments in two parts. Number one, compassion. I find it very interesting that many people who use that line of argument believe that compassion exists in a vacuum, when in all reality, compassion, like any other moral principle, must exist and be bound and counteracted by other moral principles. Let me give you an example. If I'm a compassionate person, but I lack loyalty, my compassion will become toxic to anyone who I had a prior commitment to. And a society that exists in defiance of prior commitments cannot exist at all, because now you can't have relationships, you can't have contracts, you can't have alliances, you can't have unions, you can't even go to the store because you're not sure if the store owner will keep their promise that the products there will be safe and operational for you to consume or use in whatever capacity you use. So that's one thing. Compassion without loyalty is ruin. But compassion without prudence is self-destruction. Because if I'm compassionate without first considering the implications and the effects of my compassion, how in the world can I ensure that my compassion does not cannibalize me and eat me alive? How can I ensure that my compassion does not destroy everything else I'm trying to do? No moral principle can exist unbound by another, lest it lead to some kind of ruin. That's the first argument. The second argument, though, is more interesting. This is the idea that need generates obligation. It's an idea from pure sentiment. Now, don't get me wrong. Sentiment is actually a very important part in how we as human beings think and develop ideas, develop theories, develop arguments, and how we relate to others. Our natural social affections actually form the basis for our moral duties and help us become rightly ordered people. So I don't mean to speak against sentiment, but pure sentiment, unbound from anything else other than that sentiment, can do nothing but produce moral confusion and ignorance. And I'll demonstrate exactly why. The idea that need generates obligation on the part of the person actually is a similar idea to what the Marxists have as their ethos, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Now, just as the Marxists are incorrect in their formulation, the people who believe need generates obligation are incorrect in several ways. Number one, they cannot answer the problem of limitations. Number two, they cannot account for the lack of connection. And number three, they cannot justify their stance. I'll go through these all one by one. Number one, they can't account for the problem of limitations. Human behavior, by virtue of man being a finite being, is necessarily limited in what it can possibly do. When we abstract this from the individual level and we put it on the level of a nation or civilization, the same is true. A nation is limited in what it can do because a nation, even though it is simply a mass of people gathered in society for mutual connection that harmoniously come together when all terms and principles are set right, a nation still has a limited amount of resources that ought to, by moral right, be directed towards the people and its own maintenance. But when it is directed instead to others, solely on the basis of their need, you are stretching the nation and you are also stretching the individual beyond the confines of their limitations, and you're causing a situation where they'll no longer be able to maintain their selves and also no longer be able to help the people they're supposed to help in the long term, because their course of action will ultimately collapse. Not only that, but you're also defying the sense of proportion they have. All behavior is undertaken with an understanding of proportion. If your behavior is disproportionate, it will not be rightly ordered, and that itself will cause problems. You will not have anything sustainable or substantive or long-lasting. You will simply have short bursts and moments that seem good, but in the long term are not good whatsoever. So the problem of limitations comes against. But the problem of connections gives us a moral identity to our actions. So not only are we limited by virtue of being humans and virtue of existing in a finite world, but our connections actually establish how our limits ought to be framed, how our behaviors ought to be directed. And it is the principle of fidelity, which is that principle of loyalty, good faith, and trust that underpins every single thing in society. From this camera I'm speaking to the very computer or your phone you're using to watch this video, to the store you go to when you want groceries. It is that fidelity which allows those things to exist in the first place, because in the absence of loyalty and good faith and trust, society is impossible. So our connections solidify our fidelity so that we can direct our actions towards those to whom we're obligated to. But this also, forget fidelity, this goes way beyond fidelity. This goes towards justice. So if I cannot be connected to somebody, how can I be just or unjust towards them? This goes towards truth. If someone does not believe the words that come out of my mouth, how in the world can they actually understand the truth when they hear it? This goes towards the entire moral fabric identity of society. The moment you divorce my actions from my connections, I can no longer act in a rightly ordered way. I am now an unrestrained person birthed and acting in chaos. In justification. You cannot justify stretching man beyond his limitations, nor can you justify unbounded principles, nor can you justify destroying connections without anything that is valid to justify that. And of course, being that it leads to the destruction of civilization, there's not many valid points to be made. So this whole idea that need generates obligation is incorrect. Connection generates obligation. Not our social affections generate obligation. Our prior engagement generate obligation. Our common shared nature as human beings generates obligation. And these are things that far predate anyone's need. Everyone has needs. There are unlimited needs and unlimited wants in this world. And if those were to justify any kind of moral behavior, our moral behavior would become impossible, it would become abstract, and it would become too impractical to actually enact in the real world. Man would be a limitless being, an almost kind of divine figure that he actually is not. So need will never justify obligation, nor will compassion. Now here's the argument that we dealt with benevolence. Here's the argument from utility. This is where some people will actually say, well, you know, Christian, we actually do need immigrants because they help us fill positions that no one else wants to have, or they help us have high-skilled positions when we don't have that same kind of labor here in America, or so on and so forth. And we actually should have a limited immigration policy, Christian, but actually a limited immigration policy should be based upon how well the immigration benefits our country. Now, while the argument from utility is a little bit more reasonable than the argument from benevolence because it's much more measured and calculated, it is still incorrect because it treats citizenship as a negotiable economic commodity to be leveraged and to be used to the benefit of GDP or to the benefit of some base calculation. And this is an incorrect way to treat citizenship, and most importantly, it's an incorrect way to treat the levels of political order, which are geared towards the preservation of good governance, which does not concern utility, but it concerns strong adherence to the natural law and strong adherence to first principles. So from the very offset, the approach from utility is incorrect. And there are many well-meaning folks who believe that immigration policy ought to be based on utility, but in all reality, it defies the foundations upon which it's undertaken. And this leads us to the question, my friends, of citizenship. What does it actually mean to be a citizen? Well, there actually are three dimensions, my friends, of citizenship. And all of these dimensions, when citizenship is actually strong and correct and understood substantively, work together harmoniously, like all the parts of a machine work together to produce an effect that machine is meant to. Like all the parts of a car work together to produce that effect of the car driving and driving well and remaining well steered, so on and so forth. So citizenship is not a partial concept. It is an integrated concept that we have to understand. And when one part is removed, like a pillar being pulled from underneath a building, the concept collapses. And when one part is focused on, the concept also collapses because it's not being viewed in its full light. So citizenship, my friends, is not simply a question of economic calculation or utility. Citizenship, my friends, is first and foremost a question of morality. Then secondly, citizenship is a question of civilizational preservation. Then thirdly, citizenship is a question of political order. Let's go through this all the way through. You're getting some depth today, because that's the only way we're actually going to be able to handle this problem. Number one, morality. Citizenship essentially suggests a kind of fidelity towards the nation, towards the society, towards the commonwealth, as Cicero would say, the civitas that the person exists in by virtue of being a member. So citizenship in absence of fidelity is merely you having an empty title that produces no effect on your action, because any title you have should ultimately produce an effect on your action in some way, shape, or form, or otherwise it wouldn't be a very sound title, would it? If you call yourself a doctor, but you don't actually do things that doctors do, what in the world are you calling yourself a doctor for? If you call yourself, for example, a YouTuber, but you don't actually make videos ever, or you never have, how can you call yourself a YouTuber? So on and so forth. So how can you call yourself a citizen if you lack fidelity to the Commonwealth, if you lack fidelity towards your other fellow citizens? And this is the most important thing. We are incorrect to assume that citizenship is merely a legal designation that is brought forth by the Customs Office and that is then calculated in the Census Bureau. But in all reality, citizenship is moral order. Citizenship is how well we can be loyal and have fidelity towards the society we are in and others within the society without going off the course. And fidelity, as I mentioned, is that principle that keeps society together by encouraging good faith and trust and loyalty within everybody. So that's the first dimension of citizenship. Then you have the civilizational dimension of citizenship. Whenever you're a citizen in a nation, especially a nation like America, you are assuming and taking upon you the entire weight and history of that country as you claim its namesake. As an American, you inherit an intellectual tradition that stretches back 250 plus years that sought to put upon posterity a project to be continued into the future. This is ultimately one of the most important things about citizenship, because when you become a member of society, you inherit the history of that civilization and you become a part of it as well. So it also is a civilizational aspect. People get wrong here when they try to say that citizenship is civilizational, therefore citizenship should be bound to people who have an ethnic disposition or whose identity and ethnic makeup actually fits what was fit when the nation was first founded. This is incorrect because, again, citizenship does not just require the civilizational part, but it also requires the moral part. And also, loyalty to a society and a citizenry is not merely a matter of being ethnically oriented. In fact, it's not a matter of that at all. It's a matter of endorsing the values entitled and enshrined in that civilization. Without those values, no amount of genetic lineage is going to matter whatsoever. And even in the presence of those values, it doesn't matter at all. That's the civilizational part. Then the political part. The political order of a country has a direct interest in making sure that citizens remain loyal to the country, and also, most importantly, that the concept of citizen itself is guarded and regulated in the way that only a government can do. Therefore, the political aspect is very important. However, where folks mess up here is when they say that I want to have legal immigrants. I don't care who they are, as long as they come legally. Well, legality is a process. It's a process that can change and does change by the whims of whomever is in power. So if your concept of citizenship is based solely on whoever is in power and their whims, you have no strong foundation upon which to build a concept. You have no strong foundation upon which to build any kind of moral order. You have no strong foundation by which to reinforce the truths of civilization. And therefore, you have no strong foundation by which to have a coherent concept of citizenship. Because it does not matter. I don't really want more legal immigrants, to be frank with you. I want people that are going to have that unity, that tripartite unity of being a loyal moral agent in society, of being a loyal carrier of civilization, and then having that reinforced by political laws, not having political laws be the basis of what we build citizenship off of. This is a very important point that oftentimes goes untalked about in the conversation. And so, this concept of citizenship, my friends, then justifies a more restrictionist approach to our immigration process. Given its many components and facets and inner working parts, it's clear that utility cannot satisfy the demands of citizenship, and mere benevolence atrophies the ability of citizenship to remain a sound concept. Therefore, we are only left with a restricted, limited posture, justified by the principal limitations that defend citizenship in its full power. So as such, there are two forms of immigration, or rather one form that I think will be the best kind, if we are to have any kind of immigrants, to maintain the consistency and the strength of citizenship. There is principles-based immigration, and then there is sentiment-based immigration. Sentiment-based immigration or migration, these are the things that lead to the atrophy of civilizations. These are the things that lead to benevolence being held over us as a standard rather than first principles. These are the things that bring corrosion to fidelity and justice. It's not good. But if we marry sentiment with principle, then we'll be reflecting a core tension within the hearts of man, within the core of human nature, which is that man is not merely a rational being, but he's also a social being. But he's not merely a social being and a rational being, but he's also a sentimental being. So the social, the rational, and sentimental have to work together to produce a well-ordered man. Therefore, we can have the sentimental and the social with the principles that guide our immigration policy, but we can't have one divorced from the other unless we get chaos. That's how it should work. And so if we marry sentiment with the principles that should guide citizenship, we can actually have a restrictionist policy that respects the dignity of people while still defending the reality of the civilization, the reality of civil society. And we can do so by having that policy embrace the following. If you're going to come to the country, you're going to have to have moral education. You're going to have to be taught about what the natural law says, about what the moral requirements are for you as a member of civil society in a free society. You're going to have civic education. So not only have you had the moral ideas, you have to have the concrete history of the country and the civilization so you can carry that weight upon you. Without civic education, without moral education produces zealots and dogmatists. Moral education without civic education produced abstract thinkers. Both of them produce statesmen and citizenship. So we need to have that. We have to be willing to also automatically bar people from certain countries. If you come from a certain country, no matter who you are, If that country has an old world disposition, that old world disposition is one that prides status, one that prides structure and power over a sound moral understanding, over the dignity of peoples, over the rights of peoples, over duty and obligation put in the cast and forth in a free society. If you come from any country like that, you should not be let in, because we can't risk those ideologies bleeding into our country and being justified by some vain, unrestrained compassion. Deportation must be part of this sentiment plus principles immigration program, because deportation is the only means by which a country can effectively defend itself and correct the wrong behaviors that fly against the principle of justice that those who do not fit with the country oftentimes carry about. We must also be willing to bar people with certain ideologies. If you are a communist, if you are a monarchist, if you are no matter what if you are an Islamist, if you are anything that resembles the old world and that goes against the ethos of our country, you cannot possibly be let in, because you're going to corrode fidelity towards the principles of our country, and you're going to not be able to fully embody the 3 tiers of citizenship that I laid out before. We should have very little consideration of economics when it comes to immigration as well, unless it concerns specialized workers. But if it concerns specialized workers, the American worker must always be put first and must always be considered over these specialized workers. The moment the American worker, and there are many capable people who live here in this country, are put beneath the specialized worker from another country, for whatever reason, is the moment your immigration policy has become corrosive to the nation, and it's the moment you've broken the fidelity that political order must always have to its own people. It's the moment you committed an immoral wrong, and it's the moment that policy should be reversed. So even when we consider specialized workers, and we may need specialized workers if we have a glut of skills that we cannot fulfill as the principles of comparative absolute advantage dictate, but this should not be a licentious permissiveness that pervades the whole of the immigration policy as it seems to do right now. And most importantly, we must create a moral culture of fidelity, a culture of the mind around policy conversations that preempt any future consideration of immigration that may change the tone. The ideas that a culture holds are going to be the core bases from which they consider any issue. And if our ideas are based on utilitarianism, what's going to work best for the maximization of economic GDP, or benevolence, what's going to be the best for the compassion of the people who need it, we're not going to be able to actually consider these things substantively beyond a narrow viewpoint. We must have the full range of the principles that come from our common nature as human beings, that act with a great force upon our conduct, make our conduct duty to consider these issues. And the only way we do that is if we emphasize the importance of fidelity in our culture and get rid of people, deport people, kick out people who do not embrace fidelity whatsoever. It seems harsh, but justice does not always seem kind, even though it's just. And we ought to have dignity when we're doing these things, but we ought not to be shrieking violence that hide behind vague moral notions divorced from a total moral universe that I just described. Justice is going to require hard decisions, but hard decisions ultimately, in my opinion, are all the more worth it when they are directed towards righteous ends. My friends, this is a problem we're going to have to confront with our full chest, not with despair, not with nihilism or doomerism, but with an understanding of what it takes to maintain a country and what it takes to grow a country. But if we don't confront this with our full chest, if we don't confront it with the fullness of our conviction and our conscience, my fear is that America as a civilization will collapse. It will cease to exist. Civil society will be eroded, and it'll be very difficult to pick up the pieces in a country that looks completely foreign to what it was set up to look like and what it was set up to be in terms of its moral identity and its civilizational identity. My friends, this is a very strong moment for all of us, but we ought to take it in stride. We ought to act with, again, the moral conviction that citizenship requires, and we ought to act with justice in mind, because if we do that, I believe the best days of our country are most certainly ahead of us. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. If these words inspired you and you want to get involved in the fight to restore philosophical clarity and moral rigor to the American Republic and to our public discourse. Join the Pensive cohort, my friends. Be sure, of course, to join our Discord to do that. I am recruiting an army of young thinkers that are going to go ahead and learn about the thinkers that set up the context for our country and then push them into the future. Of course, if you simply just enjoyed the message, then I would encourage you to like, share, comment, subscribe. If you want to, you can donate to me. It'll help me continue bringing good content to you, my friends. Be a good citizen if you're an American, or if you're not an American, be a good citizen of your country. Study history, study philosophy, remain more convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.